Okay, so today we're going to deal with the lesson In Praise of a Humble Comma by Pico. And the main focus of this essay is to point out the lack of respect towards the comma, the comma, the punctuation that we use, and the other punctuations like the comma. So Pico tries to show us how important punctuation is when we try to understand a lesson. If we need to understand the writer's tone, if we need to understand what he means, we really should understand the punctuation, right? So as writers, we also should be enthusiastic about using punctuation because that creates a kind of, magnanimity towards the subject that we are approaching. That gives a kind of total completion to the subject that we are approaching. So here he goes into the very tiniest detail of punctuation and he shows us how punctuation affects culture, how it affects fluidity, and how there would be no meaning in the text without punctuation. So he tries to tell us how important punctuation is. So I've already given you a description about Pico, or maybe an introduction about Pico. So now we're just going to go directly into the lesson. So Pico uses a wide variety of comparisons to show his point or to bring out his points bring out his argument that commas are very, very important. So in this lesson, he is actually concentrating on one aspect of punctuation, that is the comma. So in the beginning of the essay, he tries to compare the comma to a pedant stick. We'll come to that, right? So why does he do this? Because this comparison was actually used to show that sometimes commas go unnoticed in our everyday lives. While we read lessons, we fail to notice the comma. And where would we be without the comma? So Iyer goes on to say that if punctuation marks on the road signs placed along the highway of our communication, then the comma, he calls it comma, a flashing yellow light that asks us only to slow down. Right? So this is how he starts. So we'll just read the lesson. You can just follow the text as I read and explain the text for you. The gods, they say, give breath and they take it away. But the same could be said, could it not, of the humble comma. Add to it the present clause, and of a sudden the mind is quite literally given pause to think. Take it out if you wish or forget it, and the mind is deprived of a resting place. Yet, still the comma gets no respect. It seems just a slip of a thing, a pedant stick, a blip on the edge of our consciousness, a kind of printer's smudge almost. Small, we claim is beautiful, especially in the age of the microchip. Yet, what is so often used and so rarely recalled as comma, unless it be breath itself. So, in the beginning of the essay, he goes on to say that God gives us breath, and it is God who takes away the breath. So, can't we use that analogy for the humble comma? So, he calls the comma the humble comma, right? So, he goes on to say that, when we add a comma to a sentence, there's so much of change, there's so much of meaning that is added to that entire sentence, right? So commas actually add breadth to a sentence. So it compares, there's a comparison, you can say a kind of metaphor he uses to compare comma to God, to breathing, and he shows us his belief that commas are very, very powerful in language and they are very, very important. Because if you try to forget the comma, the meaning of the sentence or the beauty of the sentence is lost, right? So he also in this text that he uses or in the text that he writes or the essay that he writes, you can see how he puts the comma in the correct places, right? So he is giving us examples by way of his own writing of the importance of the comma. So look at this, add it to the present clause and comma, or of a sudden comma, the mind is comma, quite literally comma, given pause to think semicolon. So he uses the sentence to give an example of a sentence with commas. So he tries to explain to us how important a comma is. He says, even when the comma is so important, People do not respect the comma. It seems just a slip of a thing, a pedantic. Who is a pedant? A pedant is a person who overemphasizes rules, who overemphasizes minor details. So, sometimes we think that we put a comma just to overemphasize a minor detail, but that's not how it is. It's not a blip on the edge of our consciousness. Blip means something that is very small. It's not something that's very small that is on the edge of our consciousness. It's not like a printer smudge, but these are the ways that we describe the comma. We think of the comma as a slip of a thing, as a very insignificant thing, as a pedantic, as something that overemphasizes rules or overemphasizes minor details, or sometimes we think it as, or we consider it as a blip on the edge of our consciousness, something very small. Sometimes we see it as a printer smudge, a kind of smudge that has been a mark that has been made by the printer, and a mark made by error. Like, it's not intentional, an unintentional smudge, the ink smudge. So we consider the comma as something very insignificant. And he also says, we are people who go on to say that small is beautiful, right? We always use the term small is beautiful. And especially we are living in the we're living in the IT age, or we can say we're living in an age where there's so many things online, the digital age. So, we talk about the microchip. So the microchip is very small, and so much of information can be stored on the microchip. So we always say small is beautiful, yet what is so often used and so rarely recalled as comma, unless it be breath itself. Even when we say that small is beautiful, even when we say that the microchip is beautiful because it kind of stores so much of information, even when it's so small, we don't give that much of importance to comma. He says a comma is so important because a sentence without comma would be, a kind of missing sentence, right? So how much better a sentence would look if there are commas, right? So he tries to give us the example. He tries to give us many examples here, and he also tries to give us the example of a sentence with commas, right? Okay. Punctuation, one is taught, has a point to keep up law and order. Punctuation marks are the road signs placed along the highway of our communication to control speeds, provide directions, and prevent head-on collisions. A period has the unblinking finality of a red light. The comma is a flashing yellow light that asks us only to slow down. And the semicolon is a stop sign that tells us to ease gradually to a halt before gradually starting up again. By establishing the relations between words, punctuation establishes the relations between the people using words. That may be one reason why school teachers exalt it and lovers defy it. We may love each other and belong to each other. Don't let's ever hurt each other. Nicole, don't let's ever hurt each other, wrote Gary Gilmore to his girlfriend. A comma, he must have known, separates inseparables in the clinching words of H.W. Fowler, king of English usage. So when we come to the second paragraph of his essay, we understand that uh, he brings in a lot of, there are a lot of metaphors that are used here, right? So in the first paragraph, we see how he uses a sentence with a lot of commas to give us an example of how important a comma is, right? And he also uses something called the personification, because he calls the comma humble. He is trying to connect it to human beings, right? So the figure of speech that he uses in the first paragraph is personification when he calls the comma humble, because humble is a terminology which we use to address human beings. So he's trying to connect the comma to humans. Then you look at the words that he uses: tick, blip, smudge. See, all these words are actually giving us a sense of inferiority, because as though, they're not needed. Now, why does he use these words? He uses these words to show us how the comma is looked upon at by people, right? But Moving on from that, he tries to tell us that punctuation is very important because punctuation can establish the relationship between people and words. So he has a long recurring metaphor here comparing commas and other punctuation marks to traffic signals. So without traffic signals, there would be total disorder, there would be total chaos on the street, right? And this shows us how important punctuation is because without punctuation, sentences would also be in chaos. Just like without traffic signals, there would be chaos on the roads, on the streets. Without punctuation, sentences would also be in total chaos. There'd be total anarchy, I would say. Right? So he uses a lot of metaphors here. So he says, punctuation, one is taught, has a point. One is to keep up law and order. So punctuation marks are the road signs. So that's a metaphor that's used there. Are the road signs placed along the highway of our communication. Now, why are punctuations there? To control speeds, to provide directions, and prevent head-on collisions. So this is what happens, on the streets. Like if you don't have traffic signals, people will not control their speed. There won't be any proper directions for us to go, and sometimes there'll be head-on collisions. So these kind of things can also be avoided by using proper punctuation in sentences. Otherwise, sentences would lose their beauty. The beauty of the sentences would be marred. Now he says a period. Now he goes on to speak about the different kind of punctuations. First one, a period. A period means a full stop. A period has the unblinking finality of a red light. Now, what does a period do? What is the function of a period or a full stop? It shows us that the sentence is complete. There's a finality to it. So it can be compared to a red light. The comma is a flashing yellow light that asks us only to slow down, right? So, it's a kind of the yellow light or the orange light that we say, it tells us to slow down. So comma is used in a sentence when we want to indicate a pause. When we move from one idea to the other and you want to put a pause, you put a comma. And the semicolon is a stop sign that tells us to ease gradually to a halt before gradually starting up again. So, the semicolon is also like, a kind of stop sign. Now, when do we use a semicolon? A semicolon is usually, a period and a comma, right? That is a period on top and a comma at the bottom. That is the semicolon. Now, when do we use semicolons? We usually use semicolons to link independent clauses instead of a conjunction, right? So we want to say a sentence. She came in, suppose a sentence like this. She came into the room and switched on the light. Now, and is the conjunction there. So we want to remove the conjunction. So we say, she came into the room, semicolon, she switched on the light. So what does that show? That shows us, like, and that second she would not begin with a capital letter, right? So it would not begin with the caps, right? So she came into the room, semicolon, she switched on the light. So it shows us gradual stop, then start up again. So you don't want to use the conjunction there. So you're going to kind of have a kind of stop. It shows us like, ease gradually to a stop and then start up again. So you want to convey both the sentences are independent clauses. She came into the room, she switched on the light, right? And you can use a semicolon there to indicate that you don't want to, that there's a gradual halt and then you're going to start up again. So you're not going to use the the conjunction there, right? Okay, so you can think of other clauses like that. She loves to dance, but she hates singing, right? So you say she loves to dance, semicolon, she hates singing. So it's a kind of, two independent clauses linked together. You're not using the conjunction there, and there's a gradual halt, and then you start up again on a new thought. So that is the use of the semicolon, right? By establishing the relations between words, punctuation establishes the relations between people using words. So, what is he trying to say here? He's trying to say that punctuation is very important because it can establish the relationship between people, right? With words, communicate with words, so it can establish relationship between people. That may be one reason why school teachers exalt it and lovers defied. So he gives two examples there. He says school teachers exalt the use of punctuation because it helps us to establish relationships. And lovers defy it. Lovers look down on it. So he gives us the example of two lovers here, Gary Gilmore and his girlfriend Nicole. Now, when you read about Gary Gilmore and Nicole, you can go back to maybe 1987. You talk about two lovers in America who actually fell in love with each other. Both of them had very distorted and horrible backgrounds. So she was 19 and Nicole was 19 and Gary Gilmore was 35 when they met. But because he was actually a convict. He had been in and out of jail for small or big offenses, and slowly they hit off well. And she also had a very tormented and a very very painful past, a very painful childhood of rape, of molestation and all. So they both hit off well, and but then they have all their addictions like smoking, drinking, drugs. So even when they hit off well, what happens? They're so much in love with each other, but they cannot get rid of their addictions. And slowly, they have quarrels, they have fights, then they break off. Then he is arrested because he starts stealing something for her, like cigarettes and drinks and alcohol. So he's in and out of jail. And slowly they have a major tiff. They have a major tiff, and then he's arrested. He's so upset that he goes around doing a series of crimes, killing people. As a result of that, he's put into jail. And in jail, she comes to meet him. So they have this kind of very, a very tumultuous relationship. You cannot say it's love, but you cannot say it's not love also. They always felt they loved each other. They felt they couldn't live without each other. So, what happened is when he decides that he might be executed for his crime, he tells her, let's die together. And she gets some sleeping tablets for him, which he has in the jail, and she also has sleeping pills at home, and both of them are discovered, taken to hospital. And ultimately it's a kind of a very tumultuous, very kind of I would say disastrous love affair. And ultimately he's shot because he's executed by the firing squad. And then she's alone. And then when you read about Nicole's life or Nicole's life, you'll understand how she found through all this torment and through all this misfortune and pain and turbulence. She tried many times to take her life, but ultimately she has a very close contact with God and her life changes. So that is their story. You can just read about that. And when Gary Gilmore writes to Nicole, he writes, we love each other and belong to each other. Let's don't ever hurt each other. Nicole, let's don't ever hurt each other. There's no comma. There is no semicolon, nothing. It's just one long sentence, right? We love each other and belong to each other. Let's don't ever hurt each other. Nicole, let's don't ever hurt each other. So why do you think he wrote that? So according to the writer, he says that they were lovers. They always felt that commas would separate people who are inseparables. They never want to be separated. So, this is the kind of relationship that is established by way of punctuation. So the thing is, here he is trying to bring into account the fact that teachers or educators exalt the use of comma, whereas people like lovers, like Gary Gilmore lovers, they do not give any importance to the comma because they always feel that comma is something that can separate inseparables. They always consider themselves as inseparables. So they're afraid to put the comma into a sentence because they feel that the kind of separation that is indicated in the sentence might actually move into their relationship. It might actually kind of drain into their relationship, and they don't want that kind of separation in their relationship. And that is why it said lovers defy it. A comma, he must have known, separates inseparables in the clinching words of H.W. Fowler, the king of English usage. Now, H.W. Fowler was a lexicographer, and he was the person who authored the Dictionary of English Usage and also the Concise Oxford Dictionary. So he has used this term, separates inseparables, and that is the terminology that Pico Iyer has also used here. Pico Iyer says Gary Gilmore or lovers like Gary Gilmore do not like to use punctuation in their sentences because they feel that the kind of separation that is used in the sentences might slowly kind of filter into their relationship. They don't want that separation in their relationship because they're inseparables. This is just a kind of, a humorous way of looking at it. So he goes on to say, punctuation then is a civic prop, a pillar that holds society upright. A run-on sentence, its phrases piling out without division, is as unsightly as a sink piled high with dirty dishes. Small wonder then that punctuation was one of the first proprieties of the Victorian age, the age of the corset that modernists threw off. The sexual revolution might have said to have begun when Joyce's Molly Bloom spilled out all her private thoughts in a 36 pages of panting, unperioded, and officially censored prose. And another rebellion was surely marked when E. Cummings first committed God to the lower case. So now he goes on to say that punctuation is a civic prop. So he compares punctuation to pillars in order to show how important they are. So pillars are needed to support buildings, right? So just like punctuation is needed to support sentences, he says that, just like pillars are needed to support buildings, punctuation is needed to support sentences. So again, a metaphor is used, right? So he says punctuation is very important in society. Punctuation is then a civic prop. It's a pillar that holds society upright. So he compares punctuation to something very solid in society. It is definitely needed to hold society together. So it is something very important to society. So just like pillars are required to support buildings, punctuations are needed to support sentences, right? So he brings in a simile here. A run-on sentence, its phrases piling up without division, is as unsightly as a sink piled high with dirty dishes. So the simile that is used here is as unsightly. Unsightly means it is a sore to the eyes. It's a very dirty sight. As unsightly as a sink piled high with dirty dishes. So what is it? A run-on sentence. So what is a run-on sentence? A run-on sentence is, when you have two or more independent clauses which are not connected properly. There are no connections, there are no proper connections, no conjunctions. They run on to the other. So a run-on sentence, when its phrases pile up without division, that means there is no division. There is no proper there's no kind of proper connection. They're not connected by conjunctions. They're not properly connected. Such a kind of run-on sentence is compared to a sink which is piled high with dirty dishes. Now, why does he use this simile? He uses this simile to show that without punctuation, sentences would be ugly and would need to be fixed. So, it shows us that he feels that punctuation is very, very important. So, when you look at a sink, a sink which is piled high with dirty dishes, right? It looks such a bad sight, right? It's a very horrible sight. You don't like to look at it. It's an unsightly scene to have a sink piled with dirty dishes, right? So you want it's a kind of, something that looks very, very ugly. Similarly, a run-on sentence is also ugly, meaning a sentence without punctuation is not at all good. It does not look beautiful. It is very ugly. So when you look at a sink which is piled high with dirty dishes, you want to get it done. You want to clean it up, right? Similarly, when you have sentences like that without punctuation, they look so ugly that you would definitely want to fix them. Small wonder then that punctuation was one of the first proprieties of the Victorian age, the age of the corset that the modernists threw off. The sexual revolution might have said to have begun when Joyce's Molly Bloom spilled out all her private thoughts in 36 pages of panting, unperioded, and officially censored prose, and another rebellion was surely marked when E. Cummings first committed God to the lower case. So he talks about the unbridled, unperioded diction, right? Unperioded diction. So, you should have kind of sentences, you should put periods. If it's not perioded, it looks unsightly. It's unbridled, right? Now he talks about the Victorian age here. Now, what do you know about the Victorian age, right? So he says punctuation is the signature of cultures, and because and to simplify that point, he says that punctuation was one of the first proprieties of the Victorian age. Now, if you read James Joyce's Ulysses, you understand that Molly Bloom is one of the characters in James Joyce's Ulysses, right? She is a fictional character in the novel Ulysses, written by James Joyce, which was published in 1922. Now, she is the wife of the main character. Title, his name is Leopold Bloom, right? And the thing is, Leopold Bloom is a highly intellectual kind of person, and you have another character named Stephen Dedalus, who are intellectual, and Molly Bloom is a very physical kind of person, right? And she is a person who runs around having affairs with so many people in the novel. And the final chapter of Ulysses is often called Molly Bloom's soliloquy. Like, it's a kind of soliloquy, a kind of speech that she gives, because it's a long, unpunctuated stream of consciousness passage comprising her thoughts as she lies next to Bloom in bed. You know, it's a kind of very, it is a kind of soliloquy full of sexual connotations, right? And there are no punctuations that are used. And so that is why it's called a stream of consciousness passage. So that is her soliloquy is the 18th and the final episode of Ulysses. And her thoughts are presented in contrast to the thoughts of Leopold Bloom and Stephen Dedalus. As I told you, Molly is like, you know, her physicality is contrasted with the intellectualism of the male characters, especially Stephen Dedalus. Leopold Bloom is Molly's husband. So, you know, in this novel, you know, there are no chapters actually. It's actually numbered episodes, right? And in the last, you know, in the last final episode, when Molly accepts Leopold into her bed, the kind of the kind of words that come out from her mind, you know, it consists of 8 enormous sentences, huge sentences, and there are no full stops, no commas, nothing. Only the concluding full stop following the final words of the kind of the thought pattern is one of the only 2 punctuation marks in that chapter, right? So, you know, this episode, you know, when written, this episode contained the longest sentence in English literature, almost around 4,400 words expressed by Molly Bloom without any punctuation. So that is what you know, the Pico Iyer says here. He says the sexual revolution might have begun when Joyce's Molly Bloom spilled out all her private thoughts in 36 pages of panting, unperioded and officially censored prose. You know, so she has brought in unbridled rebellion without any periods, right? So it is a kind of he talks about the culture. He talks about how the culture changed. He talks about how punctuation is a signature of cultures, because Molly Bloom wrote all of her thoughts. It was uncensored. It was totally sexual. And he says, actually, the sign of culture, the kind of the Victorian era, as we know, was was an era where people were very, they were prudish. Nobody spoke about sex. Like, nobody spoke about things which Molly Bloom spoke about. And when James Joyce's Molly Bloom started speaking like this, or when she poured out all her thoughts in the stream of consciousness technique, we say that the sexual revolution took off from there. That means there was a change in the culture. So we see how punctuation can be a signature of cultures. And he also brings about another rebellion by E.E. Cummings, right? So when we talk about the poet E.E. Cummings, C-U-M-M-I-N-G-S, E.E. Cummings, we know that he always writes his name, with small e. It's not capitally Cummings. He's an American poet. He writes it as small e. So it is, it's his stylish, or you can say his stylistic narrative technology, or his stylistic, aspect of depicting his name, E. Cummings. So E small, both the E small and the C also very small, right? So he was an American poet, a painter, author, a playwright. So he's written so many poems, and he's a well-known poet. But he also actually, when we read about the punctuations, we understand that when he wrote works, he created some kind of scandal when he depicted the word God in lowercase. Lowercase means small letters. So that was also, a kind of revolution of cultures, right? So he speaks about God. Till then, people had been writing about God in capital G. Used to represent God as capital G. So this man, E. Cummings, his name is Edward Estlin Cummings. When he started writing, he started changing grammatical, linguistic rules to suit his own purpose, and he started assigning his own private meanings to words. Right? So but in spite of this non-traditional form, many of his poems became very popular. Right? It was this kind of experimental poetry that made it so attractive to the readers. And he was one person. He had words like if, am, because as nouns. He was a person who used all those words as nouns, and we've never used if. If is always a kind of a condition, a conjunction, and he has used it as noun. So that was the way of his poetic style or his writing style, right? And he, for the first time, he actually represented the word God in the lowercase, using the word, using the writing, representing the word God with a small g. So that is what Pico Iyer is telling us, that such things, like Molly Bloom's soliloquy, which created a sexual revolution in the Victorian age, E. Cummings' representation of God using the lowercase, all these bring about a lot of revolutionary changes. So punctuation can definitely bring about changes in culture. Right? So I think I will stop with that for now, and we will kind of